Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for what I know will be such a fascinating conversation about diversity in the workforce. So just to start off with all of you, and I'll put this to all of you, at the end of 2018, we saw that the U.S. workforce was much more diverse than years past. How have these great strides been made, and what work still needs to be done? I'll start with you first, Elizabeth.
Well, I think when you think about diversity and inclusion and, the efforts that companies have to make with really reflecting their consumer base and really making sure that the voice of their consumers, for us, Nestle, is really seen within their organization, you have to be really strategic about how you go out and recruit folks, making sure you have the right strategies internally to make sure that they're engaged in the organization. So, for us, making sure that we have that combined strategy kind of helps us make sure that we continue to move the needle in the space of D&I.
David, I'll go to you next.
I guess I work in the higher education space, and I think just like colleges and universities are beginning to grapple with the reality of the changing demographics of their student bodies, I think you're starting to see employers do that. And a lot of us were at a dinner last night. My sense is that most companies are still struggling pretty profoundly to make sense of how to do it. I mean, the reality is most leadership teams obviously do not reflect America. And I think what I've found historically is that if you as an individual leader don't have a diverse network yourself, a lot of the times when it comes to these conversations, you're at a bit of a disadvantage. And so one of the things that I always encourage leaders in my company, a lot of times they'll look at the person that has Elizabeth and say, hey, it's your responsibility to help us solve all these problems. And my response oftentimes is, whoever you are in the company, whether you're a member of a affinity group or whether you're one of the white guys who's running the business, everybody has to lean into this issue in order for us to move the dial. So if you don't have a diverse professional network, then you need to spend some time figuring out how to build that network, because hard to find talent usually comes from a network of trusted connections, and that's the way I think we can begin to move the dial.
Absolutely. And Katherine, I know you have a strong background in media and such, so talk about how diversity factors into that industry, because we know, and it's become very much a topic of conversation in the news media about the lack of diversity in a lot of these big media organizations. So how is that, how is that going so far?
Well, I've been out of the media world for a while. I mean, I can take it a click back and talk about the broader picture of how diversity is becoming something that companies are really looking at as a way to really grow the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And that also applies to newsrooms. So we talked about this with a couple of people here before, but if you look at the number of studies that have come out really in the last 2 years that are holding companies accountable when it comes to diversity in terms of how their profits are being generated, there's a lot of progress there. So there was a McKinsey study that came out in 2018 that showed that gender diverse executive teams are 21% more profitable within their industry mean. And so that's very powerful. Harvard Business Review studies that show that companies that are more diverse actually make better decisions. And so there's a lot of really interesting data there that executives are starting to collect and be exposed to. And that's really, really helping move the needle. And it's also tying everything from executive bonuses to team bonuses to building more diverse teams. So when you look at newsrooms, this also affects newsrooms as well. If newsrooms want to go out and reach bigger audiences, they want to have higher engagement rates, obviously they need to bring in more diverse team members. And I used to work at the Washington Post. I was the sixth person at the Huffington Post. If you wanted to broaden your audience, you had to bring in different voices to build that out. And so the company that I built out of my experiences in newsrooms, which were not very diverse at the time, was actually to build up data sets so that companies could bring in more diverse people. It's called Power to Fly. And the idea was that you would build funnels. You would treat it like a data problem where you could go out there, build new data sets of people, and literally go out there and invite people who had felt like they had been ostracized from these companies for years to come in and apply and feel like they could belong. So this is happening in newsrooms as well, and it's exciting to see.
Right. And Taryn, in terms of disability and hiring workers with disability, what is the status on that? Because we've seen that there's been more of a conversation about this in media in recent years, I would say, but it's not as talked about as much in the diversity conversation. Let's hear your take on that.
Sure, I think I would call it both a bad news and a good news. The bad news is that people with disabilities are still underemployed, unemployed, or not as active a part of the workforce as they could be. People with disabilities are 1 in 5 Americans across the country, and so often people don't consider that D when they're thinking about their diversity and inclusion efforts. And we are about 29 years past the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we know we still have so much work to do. If that's the bad news, then the good news is there has been a great amount of progress, particularly in the last 5 to 8 years, in part spurred by actions on the part of the federal government, but also from large global companies that are recognizing that disability is untapped talent. Disability is an area of the workforce where you can do some really innovative work, and quite frankly, there's a business case to be made as well. People with disabilities are also consumers. So you're starting to see that growth and that recognition across many different sectors that we need to proactively reach out to people with disabilities and not just bring someone in order to have them sit in a position, but rather to really bring them in and think about what does it take to build out a pipeline of people with disabilities who can then advance into C-suite.
Right. David, you mentioned before your work in the higher education sector. Talk to us more about the link between diversity in higher education, how that translates into diversity in the workforce.
Well, I think, historically, just to you, we basically power the graduate degree and short courses and boot camps for top universities. And I think, interestingly, one of the theories behind the business in the first place was, why should you have to uproot your life and quit a job in order to get a great graduate education? So what we see in our business, our boot camp business, which is tech skills development, about 30% of those students don't have college degrees. About 45% of them are people of color or women. And in our graduate degree business, our programs are more diverse when it comes to women and people of color than campus-based programs. And part of the reason is of the flexibility. And if you think about traditionally underrepresented groups in the business world and in a lot of other industries, we live in a world now where if you don't get a graduate degree or continue your higher education, you're probably at a disadvantage. And if you didn't grow up in a family with a lot of wealth or you took on a decent amount of undergraduate debt, it's just not realistic for you to go back to graduate school and have to quit your job. And so what we're seeing is kind of our model and our universities being able to truly expand access. And then on the international stage, we have students from 150 different countries that are in our offering. So I genuinely believe, like it has in many other industries, it's taking a little bit longer, that the internet is going to be able to create much greater access for non-traditional learners. And I think the key is just making sure that the access that you're creating is to high quality education where employers and the value of the debt that you're taking on is worth it. I mean, I took out 6 figures of debt to go to law school. And debt is not the problem as long as it's the right kind of debt and you're actually getting a good outcome to pay for it because it creates access.
Right.
Absolutely. And Elizabeth, we were talking before about how Nestle is relatively new to the Washington, D.C. metro area. So talk to us about how a company like Nestle, who's moved to a new metro area, is able to attract and recruit a diverse audience or a diverse workforce into its company.
Yeah, we're really excited to be in the DMV area. We're based in the Arlington-Roslyn area, so we're really excited to be here. And I think it's interesting because I think Nestle, like many companies, if you think 10, 15 years ago, you had your recruiting strategies, your name was enough, right, to kind of get the talent that you needed. And but I think like many companies, you really have to be really creative. And I think creative to recruit, but then also a change of mindset internally. So when when you talk about internally for us, a CPG company, historically we've gone after a lot of talent CPG. You come to the DC metro area and you're like, okay, well, it's different talent here, right? So, it's really been a really refreshing, to see some of our hiring managers look at different skill sets and different backgrounds. When we look at hiring, you look at military vets and the transferable skills. So we've kind of broadened even our thought process around what is the right talent and, what type of background really helps us as an organization and really diversify our ways of thinking and create new innovation. So that's exciting. But then also, like many organizations, not everybody's always knocking on the door, right, for a big company like Nestle. And so it's really made us be creative in our way of even introducing people to Nestle. So one of our newest kind of platforms is really just, even hosting getting to know sessions, right? So we just hosted here within our offices kind of a reception to get to know Nestle. So we just invited, people who were interested in the marketing, field or interested in getting to know Nestle, just to meet us as a company, as an organization, to see if there's a mutual interest and really help us, to get more diverse talent. We've done the same thing in other campuses to specifically recruit diverse talent and be very purposeful in that space. So very different than just your, having a really good ad, on your careers website, right? Really kind of building stronger connections for people so that they get to know us as an organization.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh, you're going to ask me? I just wanted to put a follow-up on that. Yeah. Fantastic, everything you said. I wanted to, I see this across, what you were saying, I see this across dozens of companies, over 10% of the Fortune 500, and we can benchmark how everybody's actually going out there and attracting underrepresented people to their company. But I wanted to ask the audience, how many, if you look at like a DMV like San Francisco, how many women, underrepresented women, do you think you need to reach out to get 100 in the room to apply to a company, let's say big tech company, Symantec, for example. I'm just going to throw out a name like that. Does anybody have a guess? 1,000. 10x that. 10,000 wow. to get 100 in the room. Wow. And how many times do you think you need to email them? 7. And then on top of that, how many times do you think you need to text message them? 10. 10. So usually 1 or 2 times. But this speaks to the issue that when you're going out and you're trying to bring these populations into these companies, you said they're not necessarily knocking on the door, you really have to make them feel like they belong, that they can come in, they can actually talk to the company to see whether or not they will belong. Mm-hmm. So because through decades and decades, they've been told, no, you're not qualified, you're not going to belong here. And so, part of this is finding the people, but the other part of it is actually engaging them and giving them the opportunity to let them know that they can belong at these companies. So it's a data problem, it's a messaging problem, and it's an engagement and belonging issue. And so if you treat it like a pipeline funnel like that, then you actually start getting the results, but it takes huge numbers at the top of the funnel.
And I know Power to Fly operates in multiple countries. I believe 12, is it?
We have employees in 12 countries.
Yeah. Okay, so from your experience in working with those employees in 12 countries and expanding to those countries, do these places have the same diversity problems that the U.S. has, or is this exclusively an American problem?
No. I mean, not at all. I mean, this is a global problem, and America's actually behind certain companies. I think there was a report that came out recently that showed that gender parity in America will take something like 200 years, but in Western Europe, it'll take less time. Yeah. I forget which country you could actually see gender parity in our lifetime. I was probably one of the Nordic countries. I can't remember, but there is a report out there that's really interesting, or in my daughter's lifetime, not in my lifetime. So it's definitely a global problem. We see Europe, for example, it's very hard now with GDPR. If you think about that from a recruiting perspective, it's harder to go out and actually invite people who normally wouldn't knock at the door at companies because of these kinds of regulations. So policy is very important when you think about this on a country-to-country basis. Obviously, GDPR affects European nationals in the U.S., but these are definitely global issues.
Yeah, and on that messaging front, Taryn, how do companies get that message out to disabled workers? How do they make them create more of an inclusive environment, make them feel welcome, like they're wanted in a workspace?
Sure. I mean, you already heard a lot of it echoed here from my co-panelists. you need a robust amount of companies across the country really creating to that culture of belonging, really encouraging workers to do the self-identification, to connect with their ERGs, their employee resource groups, and to make sure that they are coming to work as their full selves. That takes a lot of time, though, and it's not just about the posters that we put up and the webinars that we do. We also need to have the policies in place to ensure that workers can actually do the job. As someone with a non-apparent disability, I pay very close attention to an accommodation policy that a company has. So it's clear that you need to do a front-facing sort of full sweep of policies to ensure that people with disabilities are able to identify and feel welcome in your company, but you also need to make sure that you're talking to those same people. Oftentimes in the disability culture, they'll say nothing for us without us. So you're talking to them and you're ensuring that they are equipped to do the job to the best of their abilities.
Right, and I'm going to do more of a general question. You know, my day job, I cover politics at the Hill, so during the 2018 midterm elections, I got to cover, you know, the most diverse class we've seen of the 2018 Congress. We've also seen it in state houses across the nation. How does the increasing diversity of Congress and other levels of the government or state governments impact the workforce? David, I'll start with you.
Well, you know, I had the pleasure of spending, I guess, 7 years of my career on the Hill. I was chief of staff to Harold Ford, and then I was Senator Kennedy's general counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And like any other part of society, you know, the lack of, I think now there's maybe one black chief of staff on the Hill on the Senate side or something like that, very few women. So, you know, what excites me is both the generational change, but also having, you know, particularly more women leaders. I grew up in a family with 4 older sisters, so I feel very comfortable on this panel. You know, I think that one of the things that we need to do as a society is kind of acknowledge the fact. People, the older I've gotten, I've realized, like, and you see it happening right now, people don't give up power. You got to take it. And I think one of the things that is interesting is the degree to which there's a consistency of what's happening across society, whether you see it in politics, whether you see it in you know, the Me Too movement and the like, is just a growing accountability and demand for influence and a seat at the table. And so I think it's great. I mean, one thing that I will say is, we talked earlier about kind of allyship. In this conversation, I think it's also really important for you know, folks who feel that change of power structure to realize that if you embrace it, it can also be empowering for you as well. Because I've always believed that, you know, we are collectively stronger, and you know, as a Democrat, I obviously work for Senator Kennedy. It excites me how the party is changing, starting to reflect America.
Right, absolutely. Elizabeth, what's your
Yeah,
take
I
on
would
that?
just say, I mean, just to add, I think, you know, not only, you know, what's happening in the government, but I think social media, I mean, just the influence in the workplace, I think is just more informed employees that are going to require more of their companies, right? And so, you know, I'm constantly challenged in a good way, right? I think it keeps us on our toes as organizations to make sure we're addressing the needs of our employees, to make sure that they feel welcomed and engaged and that their voice is being heard from whatever group that you participate in. You know, we just launched our Thrive, which is our disability network, right? Just, you know, being informed about what's happening and what accommodations they might need if they're an ally, a caregiver, right? So, you know, I think, you know, this next generation or just employees in general in the workforce, the influence that media, what's happening in politics, just allows them to be more informed, which is great, but helps companies be better, right? Helps us figure out where we should be investing, what policies should we be looking at, what type of environment should we have, what should our next training program look like. So, you know, I think that with the noise or the conversations that are happening externally, or it's a good challenge, I think, for companies.
Absolutely, and I just want to give our audience a heads up. In about 2 minutes or so, we'll start to take audience questions, so start to think of those if you have any coming up. So, Katherine, what's your take on that? How does the more diverse Congress, the more diverse state houses across the country impact recruitment and diversity in companies?
Well, I live in Brooklyn now, so I'm a little sheltered. But I have to say it's and I used to live in DC, so I used to obsess on this. I mean, obviously it's incredibly motivating to see it, but to the point, I mean, we're making policy that actually reflects the demographics of the United States, which is really exciting, and it speaks to this larger point that if you want to make anything stronger, you need to have the voices in there that actually represent the people that you're serving, and so that's. I think it's wonderful.
Absolutely. And Taryn, before we take questions from the audience, just want to get your take on that.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think of the power of the pulpit. I work on an anti-poverty team, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about the systemic barriers that prevent people from really rising up the career ladder. And when someone like Senator Baldwin tweets about her inability to move between Chicago and DC without damage to her wheelchair, she is putting a very powerful face on the transportation barriers that people with disabilities might confront when they're looking for gainful employment. Their inability to access the type of work events or the amount of travel that really would allow them to move up in their roles. So there is something to be said about that mix of who is there, social media, and really a group of Congress folks who are really putting a spotlight on so many things that we haven't talked about.
Absolutely. And now I'll open it up to you guys. If anyone has any questions, we'll have someone with a microphone come around. They'll choose you guys. I think there's a couple of
Way in
people.
the back too.
Oh, I think, yeah. One of these guys, yeah.
This side is very active.
Yeah.
This side, warm up a little bit.
Hi, my name is Angela Arboleda. I run a small company called Innovar Strategies. And it is true that diversity and the new Congress has given more insight about the importance of diversity, but how do you really get to companies and to congressional offices and to lobbying shops and to all kinds of different sectors and say, you really do need to hire these people. These people are going to make a difference, not only in terms of policy, but also the bottom line. Because I think everybody talks about it, but in reality, when you try to put it into play, it's a different thing. And good to see you, David.
Yeah, anyone who wants
Well,
to
I mean,
speak,
I
yeah.
guess I'll start for us. We keep the conversation of talent and diversity pretty active in every conversation. I mean, our executives are always talking about it. I mean, we know from a consumer perspective that, females have 70% of the buying power within their homes, right? We know that, from an African American, perspective that, their likelihood to buy in organizations, is 30 to 40% more committed if they know that the company reflects their social issues. We know that, the Hispanic population, especially millennials, they're 50% more likely to share something on social media if they're bought into the products that, and feel that they're represented and supportive, right? So I think when you're able to connect the actual facts about what those communities and how they influence the bottom line and keep that present, and then can layer in a second part of that conversation and ask, okay, well, how are they represented, right? If we look at our marketing organization, do we have those people in our marketing department? Do we have that represented in our HR organization when we're recruiting these folks, right? And so, I think we do a really good job at keeping talent and people, first in our organization. Our CEO is very, very bought into the importance and really supports and drives the importance of people and people leadership. And so the conversation of talent and being able to have innovative mindset, a real collaborative spirit is really important to us. So, we keep it active in every conversation, making sure that we're trying our best to promote and develop and nurture. We're not perfect, but I think one thing that helps it is keeping the conversation active, which we do.
Absolutely. Yes.
I love piggybacking on your fantastic answer. One thing that I see across all these companies across the world is talent acquisition is still a cost center. And to all your points, once we start quantifying the ROI of a diverse talent and show how powerful that is and take talent acquisition from something a cost center to a growth center, we're going to really see the change that we need. It's incredibly disheartening to often see how tight the budgets are around diversity and inclusion. And I just told you how much work it is to go out and target these groups of people. Target's sounds like a bad word, but it is data work, it is collection work, it is messaging work. It takes bodies on the ground to bring people in. And that costs quite a bit of money when you think about it to do it right. And I don't think there's some companies that are starting to spend and really understand it, but we're so far right now from the real cost and energy and effort that it needs to take to build truly diverse teams, that my goal over the next 2 years is to really open that up and go to company and say, this company is doing it this way, this is what they're spending, this is the ROI. You need to do this if you want to be competitive on Wall Street, for example. If Goldman Sachs wants to compete against JP Morgan. And so those kinds of data and that numbers is what's really starting to drive the conversation more, and I'm seeing it happen, but that I think will lead to the results that we need to see.
Can I just say
Absolutely,
one
yes,
thing?
David.
I mean, I've now been in DC for almost 25 years, and having worked on the Hill, worked at a trade association for a company, as a lobbyist, ran the Washington office of a global PR firm, and now in-house in a company. My sense is there's no facet of that world that doesn't have kind of structural diversity challenges. My sense is that probably we need more people to be a little more risk takers. I think when people, the number of times I've given kind of advice to young people on the Hill about it's okay to leave and go try something else, and they don't want to leave for whatever reason. And so my view is you basically need to understand how, if you're in Washington at least, understand how this town works and how all the interrelated facets of influence shape what happens, and be intentional about trying to figure out a place where you can go. The analogy that I use is, if you're driving a car, riding a bike, or you're a pedestrian and you come up to a stoplight and there's chaos, if you've only done one of those three things, you have a different perspective. We've all come to a green light and you're the pedestrian, you're walking and you're looking at the car who's turning and you're like, would you get out of my way? I have the light. And if you're driving, you look at the pedestrian, you get out of the way. The way to have impact and influence in a place like Washington is to have the perspective of all of those roles. And so I always encourage young people to be a little bit more bold and risk-taking earlier in their career, to find something that is different than what they've done, because I think that's the way that you break down barriers, and you also set yourself up for greater success. So down the road, when it comes time to hire the next chief of staff or run the Washington office of a firm, you have the kind of experience that you need in order to be a real influence player in this town. So.
Absolutely. And I think on that note, we're actually out of time for questions, so I'm sorry about that. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to you guys. Thank you.